Shana chicos, as some of you know by now, I watched Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse 50 times in Spanish to see if it would improve my Spanish, and it did. It particularly improved my comprehension in Spanish. I can now watch a bunch of different stuff and follow what's going on and just generally get something out of it, which is all stuff that I couldn't really do before. Now, if you haven't seen that video, you can totally just watch this one first. It's not like there's going to be like spoilers or anything, but I do recommend that you go and watch that video after. I'll put it on the screen at the end. It's one of my very best videos, but I did get a lot of questions concerning that particular experiment, so I thought, combined with the fact that you lovely subscribing people have just crossed the 60k mark, I would do a Q&A about it. It's like a 60k Q&A because it rhymes and that means it's a good idea. However, don't get used to it, okay? Making videos of any kind still takes a massive amount of time and effort, and if you want to make sure that your question gets answered, it's best to join the Tim Tam Cartel. That's what I call my YouTube channel members. You can join by clicking the thing that says join, and it's only $2 a month, but they get priority answering of their comments. They get a little heart next to their name. Sometimes they get extended cuts of videos. Sometimes they even get whole videos just for them. And you know how some creators say, all this and it's only the price of a coffee every month. Well, $2 is not the price of a coffee. Like, you're not getting a coffee for $2. I wouldn't want to deprive anyone of a whole cup of coffee every month, so I just made it $2. Technically it's $3 Australian, but they're basically the same thing right now. And I did that because I wanted to make it the best value thing that you could possibly get every month, so join and welcome. Let's get into it. The first question comes from Toby, who has been a long-time supporter of the channel, and he asks something that many people wanted to know. Were you watching Rango or Into the Spider-Verse with either a transcript or subtitles? And if so, what was the ratio? And by that he means, like, were half the viewings with subtitles? Was it every viewing only 5 of the 50, etc.? Yeah, so he brings up something here which was not as well covered as it should have been in the video, which was that Spider-Verse was actually the second film that I attempted this with. In like January and February, I was watching Rango with the view to watching the film Rango 50 times, and where I am, it was available in European Spanish and Mexican Spanish, and I was mixing and matching. That is the first time I watched it in English with Spanish subtitles because I hadn't seen the film for like 8 years, then in Mexican Spanish with English subtitles, and then I was pretty sure I had the story down, so I was switching between the Mexican Spanish dub, but sometimes with no subtitles, sometimes the Mexican subtitle track, sometimes the European subtitle track, and occasionally I even tried the European dub track itself. By the way, on the film Rango, and I suspect on some other films as well, the Mexican Spanish dub wipes the floor with the European Spanish dub. There is no contest. I found that after about 10 viewings of the film, it didn't really make any difference whether I was using subtitles or which ones, because I wasn't really reading them anyway. And as everyone knows, the subtitle tracks don't even closely resemble what they're saying, and I really mean not even on the same planet. Sometimes the subtitles and the dubbing go in an entirely different direction in terms of specific details of the story. For example, and I may be remembering this wrong, but I'm pretty sure in the Latin American dub and subtitle tracks, the character Beans is actually called something different in between the subtitles and the dub. That's exactly the sort of stuff where the subtitles and the dubs get significantly out. Because when Beans introduces herself, Rango says, "Oh, you mean the word frijoles in English, like beans in English." But I think in the subtitle track, she's called something else that would be roughly the equivalent of beans in Spanish. Like, it wasn't the word frijoles, but it was kind of like evoking the same emotion that the word beans evokes in English, if you can put your finger on what emotion that might be. So you basically have like 4 different scripts to the film. You have the European Spanish subtitles, the Mexican Spanish subtitles, and then the dubs for both of those as well. And sometimes you're getting almost different stories between those two things. So I was kind of mixing and matching them, and you can see that you'll actually end up with a lot of different variations of your comprehension and your experience of the film. But to answer that question, at least for Rango, I would say that of the 37 times I watched it, I probably watched it like 12 to 15 times with some kind of Spanish subtitles. Now, in the time that I watched it, probably the last 6 or 7 times that I did so, I was actually paying a guy to transcribe it for me. So he was in the process of doing that in the last week or so. But by the time it was done, I didn't even get to read the entire transcript once. I got about halfway through it, and it was very enlightening. There were like 10 to 15 things in the first half alone that made me think, Oh yeah, that is what he says. That makes total sense now. And one of the advantages of having a real person do this as opposed to some kind of automated tool is that he also gave me cultural notes in the transcript. For example, mentioning that this character has a thick Argentinian accent, which at that time in my Spanish exposure, I just never would have picked up. But I never got to read it all the way through or watch the film after reading it because I was rushing to get everything ready to go to the USA. And I think about 2 weeks before the trip was when I had the idea of switching to Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse so as to time the release of the video for the release of Across the Spider-Verse. Now with that subtitle question and Into the Spider-Verse, it was different because while I was in North America, my video editing software added the feature of accurate automatic subtitles. Now I couldn't use that while I was over there because I didn't have the stuff on me like my computer and whatever, but also at the time that they first released it, it was available only in English. It wasn't until about a week after I got back that they added multiple languages. Now I know that there are other ways I could have accessed that technology before, but I didn't bother because I knew it was coming to the software and that was always going to be by far the easiest option for me. I talk more about that in this video right here. So it was maybe on about the 19th or 20th time that I watched Into the Spider-Verse that I had my software run it through and create the automatic Spanish subtitle track. And the first time I watched it with that subtitle track was actually in the software itself because I was going through and correcting any mistakes that I noticed. It is really, really accurate transcription software, but the movie is full of music and sound effects, like it's going to make errors sometimes. Speaking of that, I also had the software isolate the dialogue somewhat. Now this is also a new feature that I actually use on my own videos. You can now clean up vocal tracks with much better results than you ever could before. When it's a film with music and explosions and everything, there are limits to what it can do, but it still makes 90% of dialogue easier to hear and understand. By the way, for the people who asked that, this is also how I made the dialogue only version of the film. I created it manually in my video editing software. It actually doesn't take as long as that would sound like it would take. So I made it within the software, then I used a little bit of that voice isolation function, and then I had it make the subtitles for me, and then I exported that. And so from there I had a 50-minute subtitled, partially voice isolated, dialogue only version of the film. And to this person who asks, can I make that version of the film available for the rest of you? Let me just think about that. No, I can't do that. Very, very suable thing, that. I can't make it available because I have no idea what you're talking about, sir. However, if you become a channel member, there is a video explaining exactly what I did to create that. So that way you're not limited to just the films that I do it for. You can do it to any film you like. Which brings me to a question that both Burkana and Alexandria asked, which is, where did I get the downloads of the movies or TV shows from? Okay, so I own both of them on Blu-ray, but neither of the Blu-rays have a Spanish language soundtrack available. And the languages that are available on DVDs and Blu-rays in Australia is the most random lucky dip ever. So you know the movie Turbo about the snail that goes really far? I know that's a random thing to bring up, but this is just one example of so many random language choices that they make. It is available on my Blu-ray in English, Polish, and Icelandic. Where did those choices come from? And they stay that bizarre. Sometimes they sort of make sense. They're like a bunch of similar languages from similar regions. But sometimes it's like European Spanish, Danish, Maori, and Guarani. Okay, why not? So my copies of the DVDs do not have Spanish. At the time, Rango was on Amazon Prime Video and in like 25 languages, so it had European Spanish and Latin American Spanish. Right now, in Australia at least, it is not available on Prime Video, but licenses just get thrown around like crazy. So in some countries it'll be available on Netflix, in other countries it will be available on Prime Video, in other countries it might even be on Disney Plus, I don't know. And it's the same with Spider-Verse. A lot of people asked where I got it in Spanish. Well, in Australia it's on Disney Plus in Spanish. Curiously, it's only Latin American Spanish. I don't know if there's not a European Spanish dub for this film, I doubt that, but it's not in European Spanish on Disney Plus in Australia, but it is in like Chinese and Norwegian and Finnish, so it's really, really random. but at least in Australia, it's available in a ton of languages. Now, I'm hearing very consistently in the comments that while it is on Disney Plus in the USA, it's not available in Spanish, which just goes to prove my point about how random all this stuff is. It's like, yeah, no, we know that the USA has the second largest Spanish-speaking population in the world. You want to watch a film in Spanish? Nah, piss off to Australia. I made a pie chart of the number of times that Into the Spider-Verse has been streamed in Spanish in Australia. Here it is. So yeah, it is of course easier to do any and all of this if the files are available on your computer. I'm going to link to a video that talks about the legality of various websites, the main one of which is Swedish. I only found that out recently. Now, if you're going to do this, you really, really need to use a VPN. It's not really optional. It's just a really, really bad idea to do this without a VPN. But VPNs are not nearly as big and scary as they sound to non-tech people. Non-tech people hear VPN and they go like, oh, I can't deal with it. But it's really just a program that runs on your computer, you minimize it, and if it's a good one, you very rarely have to think about it being there, and it's just a good idea for a number of reasons. I use Surfshark, I have for a number of years now, and they have also recently become a sponsor of the channel, but they're not sponsoring this particular video. However, if you just want something to use and you're like, I don't know what's going on here, check out the link in the description for Surfshark. It'll take you to the Surfshark website, download it, install it. Yeah, it's not really that hard. If you're going to do what is discussed in the video that I'll link to, I recommend A, that you use a VPN, and B, please use it responsibly. Don't steal stuff, okay? Like I said, I own them both on Blu-ray. Don't use them to avoid paying for stuff. Kai asks, how did you cut out the non-speaking parts of Into the Spider-Verse to speed up the watch time? Yeah, so lots of people asked this, but Kai is a member of the Tim Tam Cartel, that is my channel members, and can thus watch my video on how I use just a couple of shortcuts in my video editing software to do this pretty quickly. And it's funny that Kai asked that because I've only just realized that the film that I used to demonstrate how to do it with is Kung Fu Panda 3, and it was specifically Kai's introduction scene. So I was using like the guy called Kai to demonstrate to Kai how to do it. And it's like an unusual name too. It's not as if his name's Thomas. Anyway, it's not too difficult. There's like 4 shortcuts. I think if I were being realistic about how long it would take a newbie to cut down like a 90-minute film to just the dialogue, probably about 5 hours. It's a long time the first time, but it'll get quicker every time, and then you've got a much more condensed version of the film to listen to. You can decide if that's worth it for you. Joe asks a non-Spider-Verse related question. Joe is also a very long time and very generous supporter of the channel. Other than the whole part where Swedish and Spanish are different languages in different language families, did you experience anything entirely unexpected as you embarked on your Spanish learning journey? So when I first thought about this, I thought, no, not really. But then I realized, yes, one thing mainly, and that is how comprehensible Spanish was after just like a month of doing the right things. So even before I went through the Refold Spanish 1000 deck in a single day, I could kind of read things if I really needed to garner some meaning from something. For example, Valaris and Aeromexico are both not great at sending emails in the language you've selected. I selected English on their websites, but they just kept emailing me in Spanish. And after about a month of learning Spanish, I was just like, I can just read it in Spanish. Obviously, it wasn't great. I was doing more deciphering than reading, but I was actually able to decipher it. After I did the Refold Spanish deck, even though I did it way too fast and didn't revisit any of my reps, I realized that I could read books in Spanish, like novels, without intolerable levels of difficulty. And I know that I have advantages, right? Like having studied French helps, having a broad English vocabulary helps, but it's not as if any of this was news to me. It was still blown away by the concept of reading a novel 6 weeks into learning Spanish. The same thing took me more than 2 years in Swedish. And some of that was due to things like I was spending time on the wrong activities in Swedish. Swedish was my first proper foreign language. Like, there were all these little things that, yes, do make a difference, but no one thing can account for an 18 times increase. I'm not saying I got to a similar level of Spanish 18 times faster, but it was genuinely 5 or 6 times faster. That's still a lot faster, right? And it's just that level of increase in my learning speed was not expected to. Vex444 asks, how do you stay motivated to learn languages that you don't use very often other than consuming media in the language? In short, I don't stay that motivated, which is why I set myself challenges where the language is secondary to the challenge itself. For example, I'd only watched Spider-Man like 10 times when I went to Mexico, and when I got back, I didn't feel very enthusiastic about Spanish anymore, but I did want to make that video, which meant watching Spider-Man another 40 times. So I was excited about doing the thing rather than the Spanish that automatically came with that. And I did a similar thing with a half marathon last year. I'd become very uninterested in running. I hadn't run for over a year, so I signed up for a half marathon because, at least for me, the very idea of running an official timed race and a half marathon at that was enough of a motivation to get me to put my shoes on for every session. So given what you said about your language situation, the equivalent for you might be something like pick one of the 4 or 5 languages that you mentioned and say to yourself, whatever happens after this is not my concern, but I'm going to do the Refold 1000 word deck at 20 cards a day for 50 days and have that be the only goal that you're concerned with for those 50 days. That's a month and 20 days, and that's your goal. And assuming you can carry through on that, you can count that as a win. And then once you've done that, and you don't want to worry about this part yet, but after you've done that, you can set yourself another short-term task-based goal. Task-based means something like reading 10 chapters of this book rather than getting to B1, because getting to B1, that's a result. You can't act on a task that is getting to B1. You can only do the things that will get you to B1. But you might want to make it even simpler than that and just have task 1 be pick one of the languages, eliminate the other 4. That's the task, mission accomplished. Then you've picked one and you say, okay, now the goal is to spend 30 hours with this language over the next 2 months. So it's like half an hour a day. That's the goal. Next question, did you watch Spider-Man 2? No, just Into the Spider-Verse. I didn't bring any other Spider-Man films into it. I had trouble even finding the time to watch this film enough times to get the video out in the time frame that I wanted to. So yeah, there were definitely no other Spider-Man films involved. Even if there were other films involved, they would not be Spider-Man films because they all suck. I'm sorry, but they just suck. Spider-Man 2, people are like, oh, Spider-Man 2 is good. No, it's not. It sucks. They're all terrible. Into the Spider-Verse and Across the Spider-Verse are the only 2 Spider-Man films that have any value. I'm sorry if you disagree, but you're wrong. I've been wanting to get that off my chest since 2002 when I watched the first Spider-Man and everyone's like, it's so amazing. I was like, what film are you watching? Question, does anyone have any idea for films and TV that are super rewatchable with high detail like Into the Spider-Verse? Across the Spider-Verse? I mean, obviously I've mentioned Rango, but I assume this person knows that recommendation. This is obviously going to vary with personal preference. I personally could watch the first 2 Kung Fu Panda films at least 20 times each. I've already watched the first one probably 16 or 17 times. But the third one is a bit of a letdown for me, but I'm thinking you could maybe do something like all 3 films 20 times each. That would give you 60 viewings total. Maybe something really intricate plot-wise like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy or other similar movies. I don't really know that many, but those kind of spy movies where it's almost impossible to tell who's on which side at any given time. But live action films are always going to struggle to meet the same level of detail that animation can meet because they can just put in things for like 2 frames. I'm thinking also like the Lego movie. I don't like it as much as Into the Spider-Verse, but it is by the same people loosely. So yeah, the question is, you have a higher level of French. Will you try the same thing? No, my French is almost non-existent. I'm not sure where you got the idea that I have a higher level of French. My French is not better than anything except my Hungarian. Question, I'm a bit more advanced, so I'm wondering what your thoughts are on its effectiveness for intermediate to advanced learners. Thanks for the question. I'm actually thinking of doing a very similar thing again for Swedish, in which I am more advanced, but the focus would be more on actually trying to learn the lines. In the video, I mentioned the lines which I was able to recite verbatim, but I would want to be able to do that for literally every line of, say, like a TV episode or the chapter of a book or something. A few people asked if I put parts of the film into Anki. I feel like some of you watching will be puzzled by that in the same way that I am. Anki makes sure that you see things again so that you don't forget them. But I was planning on watching the film 50 times. So what would Anki do that the activity itself didn't do? The only way I can think of Anki being useful is if I now wanted to go even further and actually memorize the entire script. Then I could have cards for every moment of the film, and in order to pass the card, I would need to say the line that comes next. That's the only way I can really think of using Anki to somehow further the results of this experiment. Look, that's probably helpful in some way, but yeah. Did I mention how many times a day I watched it? No, not really. So I started it just before I left for Mexico, and I think I got through about 8 or 9 viewings before I got to the USA. I didn't get any of it watched while I was in the USA or Mexico. Then I got back here and I needed to go at about once per day in order to be finished 50 times before Across the Spider-Verse came out. But then I got behind on some personal things and some work, and other things got in the way, and I went about 2 weeks without even watching it once. And I think it was on about May the 17th or something, I realized that in order to view it 50 times before Across the Spider-Verse came out, I would need to watch it like 2.5 times a day. So from that date until Across the Spider-Verse came out on the 1st of June, I think I did an average of twice a day, and I was up to like 44 times or something when Across the Spider-Verse came out, and I then had to go and watch it another 6 times after having seen Across the Spider-Verse, which was kind of a letdown because Across the Spider-Verse was all new and everything. But yeah, so I did it like once a day, and then a bit more once a day, and then 0 times for about 2 weeks, and then twice a day for about 2 weeks, and then another couple of times. The twice a day times were all the abridged 49-minute version, so that becomes a lot more possible. Question, is this a Leverkiwi reference? No, actually. I have seen Leverkiwi's video about watching one episode of an anime 50 times, but I watched it way back when he released it, and I'd kind of forgotten about it. This was actually adapted from an Eddie Burback video in which he goes to see Morbius 5 times in a row at the cinema just because it was getting so hammered by everyone as being a piece of crap. He thought it'd be funny to watch it 5 times at the cinema, which I thought was really funny, and it got me thinking like, what's the equivalent video I could make? But yes, Leverkiwi totally did beat me to this idea. I had just forgotten that he had done that. I highly encourage you to check out Leverkiwi's channel and that video specifically, so I'll leave a link to that in the description. So given what you now know, do you think that 50 was actually the right number? If you were to repeat this with a different movie, would you instead aim for, I don't know, 25 viewings? It's very difficult to describe how the repetitions affect your perception of the language. Like, I did a similar thing with the first 80 minutes of an audiobook in Swedish way back when my Swedish was very poor, and it was passive. I was driving, I was running, and I didn't count the number of times that I listened to it, but it must have been somewhere near 50 or maybe even more. And there were things that would suddenly become crystal clear to me, like things that were just the most vague, distorted noise before would suddenly pop out at me on what must have been the 44th or 45th listening, and it was suddenly like I was just reading them off a page. And I don't know what prompts that change, but I know that it doesn't happen after 3 or 4 listenings. Toby, whom I mentioned before, has done a similar thing, and he describes it as like tuning into a radio, and it's a good description, and I think that the more language you did it with, the more repetition would keep being effective for longer. So for example, if you were to do this with a whole audiobook, you might find that 200 repetitions was effective, but that would also take 2,000 hours, so like, yeah, duh. But we really have so little data on it, and if I were to boil my video down to a single point, it would be that repetition achieves a result that other forms of immersion take much longer to achieve, if they achieve them at all. So anyway, guys, that's about all the questions that I had from that video and my last couple of videos. If you want priority answering to your questions, consider becoming a member of the Tim Tam Cartel. That's what I call my channel members. You join by clicking join. You get some extra cuts on videos, you get priority reply to comments, you get members only polls, and some other little stuff. I hope you got something out of this video. I hope I answered your question. If you did ask a question, but I somehow didn't answer it here, please feel free to ask it again and I'll address it as best I can. And until next time, lo quiero.